This program.
Hello, I'm Jack Perkins. Welcome to A&E Premieres, a brand new series that will showcase a variety of first-run programs every week at this time. To begin the series, we are proud to present a unique adventure story. Just around the time comedian Michael Palin was making the film A Fish Called Wanda, asked, would he be interested in following the fictional footsteps of the classic Jules Verne character Phileas Fogg for a modern version of Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. Now, the global adventures of Fogg and his loyal valet, Passepartout, have been brought to the stage and screen before. Orson Welles and Cole Porter attempted a musical version back in 1946. 10 years later, Mike Todd's star-studded film won the Oscar for Best Picture of the Year. But what the producers of the BBC had in mind was something completely different. They wanted Michael to really make the trip, following Fogg's original route as closely as possible, traveling only by land and sea, as Fogg did over a century ago. Well, Michael eagerly accepted the challenge. Besides being a comedian and a writer, he's also a compulsive traveler. And so on September 25th, 1988, with a 5-person camera crew as his Passepartout, Michael set out to make a trip around the world in 80 days. Well, from the start, the odds were stacked against him. I mean, the network of passenger ships that once sailed the high seas has virtually disappeared. Trains are only slightly faster than they were in Fogg's day. So to stay on schedule, Michael had to improvise practically every step of the way in a constant race against time. But as you might expect from an ex-Python, the entire expedition is filled with humor, even in the face of disaster. Tonight and for the next 6 weeks, join us, won't you, as A&E presents the American premiere of Around the World in 80 Days, starring Michael Palin, who, by the way, will join us here in the studio for a special interview later in the program. But first, we begin with the challenge. Welcome back to A&E Premieres, and we're happy to have with us tonight a very special guest, member of the infamous Monty Python troupe, featured in the comedy hit film A Fish Called Wanda, and of course the star of Around the World in 80 Days, actor, writer, comedian Michael Palin. Thank you for joining us, Michael.
It's nice to be here.
It was quite an adventure.
It was many adventures.
I mean, we've seen just the first episode, and already we're hooked.
Oh, well, things hot up after the first episode. The first episode, I really wanted to cover the preparation area, because I think whenever I read a good travel story or a good travel book, I like to know a bit about the traveler and what he's done and what he's packed and who he's leaving behind. So that's very much a preparatory episode. And I say at the end, you know, we're going now to a country where different rules apply, and it really begins to get rather extraordinary from now on.
A beautiful line there about Europe being a series of problems to be solved, and the world you are entering now, a series of limitations to be observed.
That's right. I think you feel, in our culture, you must change things if they're wrong, and there's a certain acceptance that you will never change anything. It's just the way things are going to be. When you go to somewhere like Cairo, you go to somewhere like India, you realize you can't go around saying, if we do this, or if we shift the money there, we will change this completely. I mean, there are countries with a lot of people living, many of them, you know, on a very sort of low and subsistence level. But I didn't see in any of those countries a sort of feeling of self-pity or hopelessness or envy. They, you know, one accepted that you're at a certain level, and there was a lot of genuine sort of content.
Which of those two views do you think is more realistic?
Well, I think the Indian view is more realistic.
All right, we've spoken a bit about the differences among cultures. What commonalities do you find as you go around the world?
Oh, Sylvester Stallone videos. Things like that.
Pathetic.
I'm afraid. There's a video belt in the world, which again stretches through most of the world, where people love to watch videos, and they're generally videos of American sort of Rambo-esque films.
Now, they also have watched A Fish Called Wanda and the old Monty Python shows, because you were recognized as you traveled around the world. Was that a
Well, I was recognized in Athens, as you saw in the last episode. That was the only time I was recognized until I got to the States. As I say, there's an area where most of the middle section of my journey, where nobody knew, they hadn't seen Wanda yet, and they hadn't seen Monty Python, which doesn't travel to the east very well. So I was, if I'd been in a sort of street cop fighting film, or if I'd been blasting a few heads with machine guns, I probably would have been known throughout the world. But comedy hadn't actually permeated that part of the world.
Yes, well, in the episode coming up, what can we look forward to?
Well, this is, this is into the unknown. I meet a camel driver who, strangely enough, has a camel whose name is Michael. And we were in the middle of the desert. He says, "What is your name?" I said, "Michael." He said, "Oh, my camel's name is Michael. And my name is Michael, too." So we meet the three Michaels. I make my debut in an Egyptian movie, and meet an extremely interesting and philosophical ship's captain who took me down from Suez to Jeddah, who has a lot of very wise things to say about journey and travel. And then I come to Jeddah, and it is the hardest and toughest part of the journey. We enter a sort of Arabian triangle from which it seems there's no way out.
Well, now, having made this trip by ship, by land, by camel, by dog sled, by many means of conveyance, but without flying. What do you think today of flying?
Well, it's what I've always felt. It's highly functional and a bit aseptic. It's rather like being in a sort of nice piece of cling wrap, you know? You soar over the world, and the aircraft cabin you're in is exactly like the lounge you get out into. It's exactly like the hotel you go to. There are no smells, sounds. You don't really touch and feel the world much. I mean, if I have to go from A to B very quickly, yes, fine, suits me. But the experience of going across the Atlantic by ship was so utterly different to going across the Atlantic by plane. And it gives you time to think about the culture you've just left, and time to sort of prepare yourself for the next one. And one of the things I found on this journey, actually, was approaching civilization was a rather depressing thing. You forget how clean sea air is, and when you're sort of 3 days out at sea, there's no pollution. And you know when you're coming into port, because about 9 hours before you actually come into port, this sort of swathe of polystyrene and old oil cans and muck and debris just begins to float out towards the boat. The fish sort of seem to disappear. And then you come in, and there's land. And you can tell land because there's a big sort of brown sort of smudge just above it, which wasn't there before. That's kind of frightening.
There are plenty more stories to come. There are plenty more misadventures to see. Thank you for being with us, Michael. Please join us next week, again, when A&E Premieres presents the further misadventures of Mr. Michael Palin around the world in 80 days. I'm Jack Perkins. Hello, I'm Jack Perkins. Welcome to A&E Premieres. In a New York Times interview a few years ago, Michael Palin said he seems to end up playing a lot of men who wander around getting into trouble, characters for whom life gets rather complicated, unquote. Well, in tonight's episode of Around the World in 80 Days, life imitates art as Michael leaves behind the timetabled certainties of Europe for the unpredictable world of the Middle East. Our contemporary Phileas Fogg will root for the wrong team at a championship soccer match in Cairo, make a cameo appearance in an Egyptian gangster film being shot in a supermarket, and stay at a hotel in Cairo whose interior is straight out of a ski lodge in the Alps. Last but certainly not least, he will hit a snag that could cause the entire voyage to collapse like a house of cards after only 2 weeks. So, without further delay, join us now as A&E Premieres continues Around the World in 80 Days with Michael Palin. Tonight's episode, Arabian Frights. Michael's mad dash across the Arabian Peninsula leads to one of the most extraordinary and dangerous adventures of his entire trip. To get to Bombay, he has to take a dhow, a small trading ship that has changed remarkably little in 500 years. without radio contact, electricity, or a crew that speaks English. Michael spends the next 8 days at sea in waters still littered with mines from the war between Iran and Iraq. It's truly an experience far more primitive than anything Phileas Fogg encountered. I hope you'll tune in next Sunday night for the further adventures of Around the World in 80 Days. Until then, for A&E Premieres, I'm Jack Perkins. Hello, I'm Jack Perkins. Welcome to A&E Premieres and tonight's episode of Around the World in 80 Days, starring Michael Palin. Well, after 8 days at sea, Michael has finally arrived in Bombay, but he's still a week behind the schedule, according to Jules Verne's hero, Phileas Fogg. And with a day to kill before he can take the express train to Madras, he's ready to rename the journey Around the World in 80 Delays. But as Michael writes in his diary, challenges help to make an adventure, and adventure was what he signed up for. Michael's adventures in India are the stuff Monty Python sketches were made of, like getting a shave from a blind barber, or finding 2 other Michael Palins sitting in his seat on the train to Madras. And when things start to look up, he finds a hotel in Bombay with its very own in-house astrologer. Join us now as A&E Premieres presents tonight's episode of Around the World in 80 Days, A Close Shave. You know, in a program like this, one of the last elements to be added is the narration. But Michael didn't want hindsight to distort his commentary. Instead, he wanted viewers to know what he was thinking and feeling as the situations came up. So throughout the trip, he kept an audio diary of thoughts, observations, first impressions, and this he used in writing the narration. Now, right now, Michael's immediate problem is making that connection to Hong Kong from Singapore. Join us next Sunday night to see what he comes up with. Until then, for A&E Premieres, I'm Jack Perkins. Hello, I'm Jack Perkins. Welcome to A&E Premieres and tonight's episode of Around the World in 80 Days with Michael Palin. When we last saw our contemporary Phileas Fogg, he had arrived in Singapore only to discover that his connection to Hong Kong had sailed hours before. It seemed that any hope of completing the journey within 80 days had vanished. But our intrepid explorer is a master of improvisation. And so after dodging some of the worst typhoons in recent memory, he's off to Hong Kong, to that city's legendary Bird Street. A pretty courageous move for a man who once tried to sell John Cleese a dead parrot. In fact, he's about to come face to beak with an angry cockatoo who seems to seek revenge for that classic Python sketch. After Hong Kong, China, and the most exotic meal of the entire trip. Let us join Michael now, halfway around the world and a full 10 days behind schedule. Tonight's episode is Oriental Express. Michael first met Basil Powell, his honorary passepartout, when Basil was the still photographer on one of the Monty Python films. More recently, he served in that same capacity for The Last Emperor. Next week, Michael visits the last vestiges of the days when Shanghai was known as the Havana of the East. Then it's off to the big city, Tokyo, to spend a high-tech night on the town. Quite a contrast. I hope you'll tune in next Sunday night as we continue Around the World in 80 Days. Until then, for A&E Premieres, I'm Jack Perkins. Hello, I'm Jack Perkins. Welcome to A&E Premieres and Around the World in 80 Days with Michael Palin. First stop tonight, Shanghai. Now, 40 years of communist rule have pretty much wiped away any traces of the decadence Shanghai used to be famous for in the 20s and 30s. But as Michael discovers, there are still some swingers alive and well in that town. Then, after a voyage to Yokohama on a Chinese ferry and a bullet train ride to Tokyo, Michael experiences the Japanese phenomenon of a karaoke bar and later sleeps off that experience in the latest triumph of Japanese miniaturization, the Capsule Hotel. Finally, there is a chance he can make up for lost time if he can gain passage on one of the giant container ships sailing from Japan to California. But first off tonight, a stunning mirage and a shocking confession. When Michael Palin learned that his trip across the Pacific would take 11 days, he wondered, how could he make it interesting for TV? One idea was to direct a production of Macbeth starring the ship's crew, but as you just saw, that idea was dropped for something more of an Animal House motif. Next week, the final leg of the trip as Michael travels across America by Amtrak, dog sled, and taxi. Will good old America know how to get him back to England on time? Tune in next Sunday night for the thrill-packed conclusion of Around the World in 80 Days. Until then, for A&E Premieres, I'm Jack Perkins.